When you say preferential, do we hear the media often refer to that as a sexual predator?
Yeah, they use that term a lot, a sexual predator. And I tend to stay away from that term because I think it's really loaded. Right, I think it's really loaded.
I think what I understand of it is that some of that comes through in the behavior they define as grooming behavior. That because, as Steph pointed out, that they're not strangers. They really get to know the person, get the trust of the person's family, or the primary caretakers, and then gain access.
Somewhat, though, I think they're really referring, because I've heard the term, actually, and seen it actually in research. Some people actually define it as a research term, a sexually violent predator, the SVP. So the sexually violent predator, those are the ones targeting strangers, right? Those are the ones that tend to not have a lot of social skills. And the ones without a lot of social skills, those are the ones that are going to attack children or take them by gunpoint, right, and use force, right? Not necessarily befriend them, because they actually have to have some social skills to befriend them, right? So I think sometimes that term is assuming that it's violent, that they're actually going out there and looking for them and actually being very predatory and taking over and abducting the victims, right? So I do think the media, and I think that actually started from police. I think police have been using that term the most. Yeah. And I stay away from that term because I think it's loaded. But good question. All right, so I think also recent research, and getting back to this last one about that sex offenders aren't able to be rehabilitated or the treatment options don't necessarily work. A lot of recent research has been showing that new treatment methods, particularly the cognitive behavioral therapy research, has shown that sex offenders are able to be controlled with their sex crimes, even some of those ones who it's very compulsive. So sex offenders who have participated in this more contemporary approach to cognitive behavioral therapy show that they had a decrease by 40% in recidivism rates. So it really can be quite effective. But before we talk about some of those promising treatment options, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of these policies. In the United States, we've seen substantial growth in recent years in criminal policies aimed at reducing sexual offenses. And unfortunately, many of these policies, as you'll see, are based on a lot of these assumptions that we've really been talking about. And then again, those assumptions aren't necessarily based on scientific evidence. The first one that you're going to be all familiar with is registration and notification laws. Right? And note that those two things are different. Right? Registration is one law, notification laws are another set of laws. But the registration laws, which basically say that all sex offenders have to register, right, with the local law enforcement department so that they can keep a track of where they are and what they're doing. But there's really no empirical evidence that shows that registration actually works to solve crimes. And that's kind of the logic behind it is we want police to know where these people are so that if they're living in this neighborhood and there's crimes occurring in this neighborhood, that they can intervene and catch that person. Right? But there's really no empirical evidence to say that that actually works, where the police use the registration of sex offenders in that way. And then there's notification laws. And notification laws basically say that this information, that registration that the police have to be made publicly available in some way. And each state has done this in a different way. Right? In New Hampshire, we have a website. Other states, sex offenders have to put a sign out from their house that says that they're a sex offender. Right? In other states, police go around to neighborhoods with flyers when a new sex offender moves into the neighborhood. Or they put out an ad in the local newspaper or on the cable network channel or something along those lines. But they've done it in a lot of different ways. And the Adam Walsh Act of 2006, if it ever gets funded by Congress, I think that will help make it more uniform across all of the states. But we've yet to really see that come to fruition. But I think it's really important to say that there's no empirical evidence to support that any of those reduce sex crimes against kids or even against adults, right? There's no evidence. And additionally, there's many unintended consequences of these policies, as I'm sure many of you all know, right? The unintended consequences are isolation for sex offenders, harassment of sex offenders, and stigmatization, which those three things are all linked to recidivating. So if we want to set up an environment that's going to make sex offenders recidivate, we've done just that. Right? We've done just that. We've had actually some instances of vigilantism. In 2006 in Maine, we had a young teenager look up sex offenders in his local neighborhood, and he went to their house, their front door, knocked on their door, shot them. He did that twice to two different sex offenders. For still motivations unknown to this day. And that's probably the most extreme of somebody killing them. But I think sex offenders experience quite a bit of more mundane harassment. The new Adam Walsh Act would actually mandate a 3-tier classification system for sex offenders. Currently, right now in the state of New Hampshire, all we have is on our website, if somebody's actually offended against a child under the age of 13, that gets put up on the sex offender website. So we all can access that information. But that would change if we have to adopt the Adam Walsh Act, which all states are going to be mandated to do, or we're going to lose federal funding. And hopefully, I think anyways, well maybe not hopefully, but I think Obama just promised yesterday to Adam Walsh's father, John Walsh, that he was going to fund that act, the Adam Walsh Act. And one of those things is that it would standardize across the states that 3-tier system, which would say, it would basically rank sex offenders, and the 3rd-tier sex offenders would be put up on the registration list. And these are the ones that do some pretty heinous offenses. But it's based on a prior record. And what criminologists have really argued here is that we need to have some kind of assessment that's not necessarily based just on the prior record. Right? We need some assessment of real risk. Right? And unfortunately, the 3-tier classification system, according to the Adam Walsh Act, is not going to do that. So we really won't know who's at most risk for reoffending. We've also had residency restrictions or zoning laws pop up in many states, and I'm sure you guys have heard about those in the news as well. New Hampshire has had 6 towns, so we don't have a statewide residency restriction zoning where the sex offenders can live or where they can't live, right? So most of those residency restrictions say that sex offenders can't live within 500 or up to 2,500 feet of a school or a park or something along those lines. Again, based on that assumption that sex offenders lurk in these areas and they're strangers and all these assumptions that we've really talked about. And so there's really no empirical evidence, again, to support these residency restrictions, and it causes even more unintended consequences for sex offenders. It makes them more at risk. One of the biggest unintended consequences of these laws is that sex offenders end up being homeless, right? So that they can't have stable housing. Many of them can't live with their families. Some of them, in fact, actually have to sell their house when they get out of prison because they just can't live in that neighborhood. And it also, some states have actually said in their residency laws that they can't live within so many feet of a bus stop, right? So we're talking about ex-cons getting out of prison who are likely not going to have a car, but yet need to have a job to have a stable life. And we're going to restrict them from public transportation, right? So really we're setting up a situation that's going to make sex offenders more likely to recidivate. Right? We're not helping them reintegrate back into society.
And this, I think I mentioned earlier, the guy I saw this week wasn't able to get a job because the employer looked him up on the registry and couldn't hire him.
Right.
So
They often do that, right? And I think that employment is a really tough one for sex offenders particularly. I mean, and they do have laws saying that they can't work with certain populations, and they should. We should, I think, restrict them from working with children.
this was a gas station.
Right, a gas station is